Kia ora and good morning. I'd like to welcome you all to our first meeting of the Economic Growth Committee on Wednesday the 22nd of February 2023. Before we get started, I'd like us to open our meeting in karakia, and I'll look to Councillor Fitzgerald to lead us in that.
Tēnā koe te kai whakahaere o te rā. Thank you, Chair and Councillor Wood. Me o te ati kia tātou e te whare, to all of those of us gathered in the chamber this morning, good morning and greetings again. Kia koutou ngā kai kaungihere kei te kāinga, me te iwi, me te hāpori a rohe, and to all those joining us online as well. Good morning, everybody. Tū taua mai I runga, tū taua mai I raro, tū taua mai I roto, tū taua mai I waho. Kia tau wai te Māori tū, te Māori ora ki te katoa, haumi e, hui e, tā ki e. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Kia ora. Thank you, Councillor Fitzgerald. So all of you are aware, Councillor Hapeta will be watching online but will not be voting today. And the Deputy Mayor will also be with us online. Today's meeting is being recorded and will be live streamed on the PNCC Council's website and YouTube channel. Health and safety for those of us who are not always in the chamber. On hearing the alarm, please leave the site immediately by the nearest fire exit and evacuate to the assembly area, which is the clock tower in Te Maraeohine, the square. Smoking is prohibited in the council building. And a defibrillator is located at the front of house on ground floor. Please report any incidents to our committee administrators. Right, we'll begin with item 1. Apologies, I have one from Councillor Hapeta. Right, we'll look to, are there any others?
Mr. Chair, I'm quite happy to, if you're going to move it, I'm quite happy to second it.
Yep, I'll move that. Thank you, and we will vote. And that has passed, 15 votes for and none against. Item 2, notification of additional items. I'm not aware of any. No, so we'll carry on through. Item 3, declarations of interest, if there are any. No. We'll move on to item 4, which is public comment, and I am aware of one from Rob Campbell, the chair of Palmy Bid, so I'll welcome Rob up to speak for 3 minutes. The floor is yours, Rob.
Thank you. I welcome the opportunity just to speak briefly today. There are a couple of items on the agenda that I think Palmy Bird has an interest in. With respect to the economic structure report, which I've read and I guess I agree with, we want to sort of point out that while this year might hold some uncertainty, the general economic conditions we think remain positive in the medium term. Some good underlying economic growth, low unemployment, and that points to quite a resilient local economy. We've had quite a bit of feedback from local businesses, particularly small business owners, worried about the impacts of inflation on their inputs, on the inputs to their businesses, and we say without exception that they should not be martyrs. There are inflationary expectations within the wider public, and holding on to those rising costs will not do them any good. We encourage them to pass them on, and I think that's the same message to Council. We really want to urge Council to continue to have an investment mindset. I'm mindful that during the post-COVID period, Council tended to shrink its activities, an understandable strategy perhaps given the uncertainties, but one that created a different set of problems when the momentum returned to the economy. We'd like you to maintain the momentum, and I say that with an ear to the discussions you'll be having on the 10-year plan and the budget later on in the year. In relation to the various transport papers and reports that have been presented and will be tabled later on, I want to say Bid is in general terms supportive of a strategy that encourages access to the city centre for all who choose to come in and enjoy the space. It's paramount for us. We are not supportive of any strategy that seeks to exclude any particular mode of access, including the junior vehicle. I don't think the strategies necessarily do that, but I want to make the comment that a large number of our visitors to the city centre come from the wider region, and they rely on their private vehicles to get here and enjoy this space. I'm mindful also that the rest of this decade should see the New Zealand transport fleet in general move to a low and no emission majority of vehicles, and we need to be mindful of that as well. In respect to the public transport plan, I think we support the removal of the pulse system in favour of a cross-city strategy. And although not all intercity occupants will be in favour, we support the requirement of buses to use the outer ring road. We think that's a good strategy. We'd like to see an investigation into the merits of augmenting the proposed public transport strategy with an on-demand bus system. We know that this has been used successfully in other urban areas and been trialled in other areas with some success. We'd also like to continue to work with Council in the development of a plan in respect of the Main Street terminal, which we still have concerns about, both in terms of its design and location. Lastly, we look forward to further consultation on the car parking strategy, particularly as it relates to the city centre. We're keen to have some continuing input into that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rob. Are there any questions? Yes, Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Rob, for coming in this morning. Hey, I just wanted to go back to where you started in your comments about encouraging an investment mindset and encouraging council to pass on the costs. My reflection is that's quite a different message than the one that we had from the chamber in what we all call the COVID budget, which was about pulling back, tightening your belt. Is that your intention?
I don't think it's necessarily different. I encourage fiscal responsibility. I just don't want you to lose an investment mindset. So let's understand what we're spending the money for and what we're going to achieve.
Thank you. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Rob. Couple questions for you in the transport space. To your point around not wanting to see exclusion of certain types of modes of transport in certain parts of the city, are you of the view that we can arrive at methods of creating priority without actually going as far as exclusion?
Yeah, I think it's possible, and I think the strategy suggests that. And as I say, in general terms, we're supportive, yes.
Thank you. Second and final question is just around somewhat that same area when you're saying that you don't want to see any forms of vehicles excluded in the heart of the city. I'm thinking about some of the very large vehicles. Do you want to see, freight that's headed for Wellington going through the part of your retail area?
I mean, I've mentioned the buses and the desirability of them going around the outer ring road, and I think absolutely heavy transport. I don't think there's necessarily a place for it in the city centre. Agreed.
Thank you. Mr. Chair.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Just the comment you made towards the end about having some concerns on the design and location of the Main Street bus terminal. I'm just wondering if you're able to expand on those comments.
I mean, I think that the design has proven to be problematic with some of the issues we're having with youth in that area. It's easy. It doesn't present the sort of visibility that you might need to control situations and maintain order. Its location alongside the post office building in particular creates hotspots for vandalism and other issues. So I think it's just the design is probably a little bit outdated and needs to be revised. And we think that space, we're open to consultation, but we think that space might be better utilised for the purposes of the general public.
Thank you. Just to clarify, so your comments relate to the current bus terminal, not
Correct.
the proposed new one. Thank
Correct.
you.
Yeah. I'm not sure that I've had any input into the proposed new one. Yeah.
The Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Rob, and thanks for making the effort to come and speak to us. On the agenda today is the strategic transport plan, which I'm not sure about other councillors, but we've only seen it for a couple of days when the agenda was released. So do you think it might need more socialisation, more wider, because there's some quite wide-ranging changes in that. Your view on should we be consulting a bit further with that?
I totally agree. I think it's this is a strategy for another 20 years, and it needs a significant amount of consultation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Rob. That's exceeded our question list. Thank you for coming in and presenting.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Are there any other public comments that I'm not aware of? No, seeing none, we will move on. We need to accept, okay. I'll move that. I'll look to the Mayor as my seconder. We've got one still to vote. Could we all just check that we voted? Thank you, and that has passed 15 votes for and none against. Now we will move to item 5, presentation by the Central Economic Development Agency. That'll be presented by the Chief Executive, Jerry Sherman, and the Chair of CEDA, Bobby O'Fee. You have 10 minutes, and then we'll go for questions afterwards.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting us here today. And it's certainly nice to be able to present to the newer members who, although I think I've met most of you at various functions, it's nice to see you in this capacity. So thank you for having us. Look, we have only 10 minutes, so I will pass on to Jerry. But I do just want to say, obviously, with the recent events in the Hawke's Bay and Gisborne and north of Auckland, we as an EDA will be here to assist and help any of the EDAs in those areas where we can, and make sure that we help them through these trying times. I suspect that it's a lot worse than most of us know, or what we've seen on TV, so unless you've been there to see it firsthand. So no, we've only got 10 minutes, so thank you, and I'll pass straight over to Jerry.
Thank you, Bobby. Thank you, Chair, and welcome to particularly our new elected members. It's the first time we've been formally in front of you since the elections last year. So we just wanted to spend time today, if I can get the clicker to work. There you go. Just to talk to you a little bit about our visions and our strategic direction for CEDA, and then talk a little bit about 2 or 3 of our key sort of anchor projects. So you'll be well aware of our vision, goals and strategic areas for CEDA. These have been well established in our letter of expectation and our statement of intent. I guess it's a back to basics for us in terms of our economic development activities. We're very, very keen on looking at these large anchor projects and large activities for the region, and then looking to see how that can have a fold out into the general community in terms of how the economic position for the city and the region looks. Of course, we have both responsibility for the city and the region. So just to flick quickly onto one of our anchor projects, the Central New Zealand Distribution Hub, or Te Utanganui. This is a classic example of an economic development growth pole. It's a long-term investment for the region, a long-term project for CEDA. We'll be talking about this when we're here in 20 years' time. It's in reality already here, but we're looking to see how we can grow it with, growing the land availability for distribution, the KiwiRail hub, looking at the ring road in Pinati, and all of those things that work together. It has wide support across the region. We have 26 partner councils who are signed up to this project, and it's a key, a sort of a hub in the node of 3 hubs across New Zealand and the Golden Triangle and Rolleston. And I'm sure with things that have been going on in the country over the last 2 to 3 months, having security of logistics supply is very, very important to not just the region but to the country. So that's a big project for us. The second one is the Manawatu Food Strategy. And indeed, yesterday was a food day in the region. We had the presentation on the industry transformation plan for the food and beverage sector out at Massey. We had lead team discussions yesterday around the food strategy, which was landed as a first draft yesterday morning at about 11 o'clock. So it's a huge piece of work for us. It's an identified strength for the region. We have been very, very lucky in having two very good teams of people working on that project. The most recent iteration has had a technical advisory group of 15 people across a very, very wide sectorial group, from food sustainability through to Te Puna Whakaronui, which is a New Zealand food innovation network. So it's really, really important for us that that strategy keeps moving ahead. It will produce a number of strategic priorities over the next wee while. And then the work for us as an economic development agency is to get the region and the sector in the region to adopt that as a regional strategy and move those strategic intentions ahead. The third piece of work that was done last year, funded out of IMBI, in terms of a COVID response, was the refreshing of the Manawatu Destination Management Plan. This involves management of all aspects of the visitor experience, including their perspectives, the need and the expectation of our visitors. But it's also important for us in terms of mana whenua, the tourism industry, but also being able to attract businesses to the region. Having a strategic DMP means that things are being linked up and are not being unmanaged in their growth. New Zealand, Aotearoa, is very big at the moment on sustainable tourism. It's not about numbers, it's about high-value tourism coming through to the country. We've refreshed it in the basis of having a large number of stakeholders involved. There were 85 inside this discussion, more than 20 workshops. And the plan has given, again, the region a clear focus on how we should be taking that forward in terms of central government commitment and commercial investors potentially being involved. You'll see there's 6 key pillars that came out of that work. I won't spend too much on them, but what's key to note at this point was there were 5 catalyst projects that were identified, and in order they were an agri showcase and food experience, a city centre hotel, there could be more than one, the Te Apiti Tourism Hub West, the Conference Centre and Hotel, and the Cultural and Civic Precinct, and the Arapuki Forest Adventure Hub. In total, there were 72 projects identified in this piece of work. Finally, in the visitor space, we are involved as an economic development agency with doing some work around the Te Apiti Gorge repurposing. We're doing some work with some consultants and with Accelerate 25 and others around trying to identify which of the 15 projects inside this piece of work and the master plan will be a catalyst project to get underway first. So we're going to be presenting those findings to the Te Apiti Gorge Governance Group, I think, at the May meeting this year. Profiling the region is really, really important for us. One of the things around this is you wouldn't consider moving to somewhere that you wouldn't spend a weekend in. You wouldn't consider investing or setting up a business in somewhere where you couldn't attract good talent, and you can't attract talent without a compelling case of things to do when you're in the city. So we've found recently that we've had a lot of contact from businesses and sectors around the region around the role that CEDA can play in putting forward the case for the region and for the city to go alongside with their technical needs in terms of what they're requiring. And I'm sure you would have seen late last year that fantastic new advertising campaign about Manawatu version 2.0, which has been really, really fantastically received. And that comes down to digital marketing. We're just doing a lot of stuff in this space. The manawatu.nz.co.nz website is getting a lot of traffic. It's being used recently. We've put up about 6 new sector profiles of some really cool businesses in the region. And one of the focuses on that is businesses that have moved here and why they've done so. So I think that's been really, really good for the region and for the city. Just quickly on some businesses, usual stuff that we do that just sort of sits alongside that key activity. Our BEAR strategy, the Business Attraction and Retention and Expansion strategy, is really, really strong for us. It's all about growing businesses, attracting businesses, being able to get them to expand where they need, finding out where the blocks might be and moving those ahead, talking to commercial real estate agents, talking to the city and to the region around where there might be difficulties in doing business and those sorts of things. Our Uman investment approach, we talked last year about this. We have 3 or 4 different tiers. One is project-based, like Te Utanganui. The other ones are ad hoc but off scale. At the moment, we're talking with a group, Mainoki, with both the district and the city and others around bringing a worm farm to the region that might enable us to do some good stuff with our organic waste. Tier 3 is ad hoc and small, and that's what we do just in our general business. And then we have our third-party led stuff by Sprout in the factory. So there's lots of stuff going on in there. Our talent and skills, we're always working with our tertiary providers. We've got Te Pūkenga with us here today around how we can, keep the businesses in our regions full of highly qualified, just-in-time skills. And we're doing a bit of work at the moment, particularly with the Regional Skills Leadership Group around staffing for the logistics and supply space. Finally, we do economic data and insights for the city and the region, and they come out quite regularly. And our partnerships are really big for us. One of the things that we're really big on as an entity is trying to reduce duplication, so we don't have multiple entities in the city and the region doing the same tasks. So that's us. I don't know what happened there. That's us. You'll hopefully all be signed up to our quarterly economic updates and our 60 seconds releases. If you haven't got those, just drop me an email and I can get you hooked up to those. We do track how often they get read. And if you want to, my door's always open. You can always drop me an email, always open for a coffee or a chat, and keen to hear what's going on in the city and the region. Thank you.
Thank you both for your presentation. We'll now move to questions. The Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Bobby. Thanks, Jerry, for that insight. A question around two areas, sector profiles and talent and skills. We get them and we get them from multiple sources, and it's good that you've identified them too. My question is there coordination? We have a policy team, and I'm not sure that's the right area that should be doing this work, but they give us sector profiles at times. We have our economists giving us profiles at times. You're doing them as well. I'm sure MDC's doing them. The Regional Council occasionally enters the space. It's great, and sometimes there's a different slight slant on them, but is there coordination in that? And also with the talent and skills, and I acknowledge Ariana Paiwai here from the regional team, and they have a group. The Regional Council are doing stuff. The Talent Central's doing stuff. The National Driver Teaching School's doing stuff. Again, is there coordination there?
That's a fantastic question. I think it's probably the best example of well-meaning organisations duplicating effort. Within the Te Pūkenga with the Regional Skills Leadership Group and the Workforce Development Councils last year, I think there were about 5 different organisations, including the city and us and RSLG in their recent work plan that was released late last year, who are doing those sort of sector profiling, particularly in the supply and logistics space and in the primary industry space. I think the recent work with Brent Morris in the RSLG team and with Accelerate 25 around bringing the organisations together. In particular, at the moment, we've got to focus on one sector, which is the supply and logistics, and that's trying to forward predict what we're going to need in terms of things like forklift drivers, truck driver licences, those sorts of things. So I think that will be a really good marker of the way to progress forward with other sectors of strength for the city and the region. Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to you both. You had on your Te Uu Tanganui slide that there was 2 milestones due in the next couple of months. Can you just extend on what they are specifically? The
yes, yep. One is there's KiwiRail's got an important board meeting coming up at the end of March, which will have some further updates on how they're progressing. And the second one, of course, will be the city planning in relation to the plan for the city in terms of land use.
Great. Yep. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Bobby. Thanks, Jerry. Just interested in your, seeing what other EDAs are doing around the country. Are there things that are happening in other regions or through other EDAs that you think we should be thinking about weaving in here over time?
Another good question. One thing that just to start off with is that not all EDAs are created equally. You would have seen recently that Christchurch NZ reported they had an inward investment tranche of 245 million this year, but they are the property management arm for their council, so they have a completely different function. But certainly in terms of the way that we've been talking to, particularly our regional EDAs, we are looking to sort of look at how we might be servicing our sectors of strength, which we think other EDAs are doing really, really well. And because of our scale and size, we've done it in a slightly different way, but we're looking at how we can tie the talent and skills discussion in with the economic development and sector support discussions so that we can pay better attention to the 10 identified sectors of strength for the region. So there's certainly ways in which EDAs of an equal footing are doing things that we're looking at. And we're doing a lot of regional link-ups with particularly Wanganui and Partners, Venture Taranaki, and there's a new economic development agency being set up in the Hawke's Bay called READER, which is very close to CEDA, which we're going to link up with them and see if we can help them set their sail as well and see what we can do, particularly in that central New Zealand picture.
Great, thanks. Also wanted to follow up around that list that you put up, I think of kind of 6 areas that fell out of that big consultation, as infrastructure, et cetera. Sustainability is sort of hanging out on the right-hand side there. Just kind of wondered if that was seen as separate from the others, or if sustainability is more of a theme that kind of ran through, whether it's infrastructure or people or et cetera.
Now look, sustainability is almost one of those things that's woven into all of our conversations. You'll be pleased to know on that note that the food strategy's anchor is looking like being sustainable nutrition. So I think sustainability for our organisation is very strongly coming through in a new vision statement we developed with the board and with Mana Whenua last year, so we're really, really happy with what that looks like. So I think it's a really, really important part of one of our pillars across all of our areas of work.
Great, thank you. Thank you both, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. That's the end of our list of questions. So thank you both for coming, and I'll let you return to your seats. I will move that we receive that presentation, seconded by the Mayor, and I will kick us off with comment then. Thank you, Jerry and Bobby. The work that CEDA does in our community is being seen. We see it particularly in line with Te Utanganui and the impact we're already having on our freight and logistics industry. We all lived through COVID and saw what happened when a company has 80% of their stock in Auckland and 20% of their stock in Christchurch, and Auckland gets put into a lockdown. The struggles that come in the logistics of trying to get that stock out of the country. And having been a part of many of those conversations with these companies, Tauranga and Hamilton are too close for a second distribution hub. Wellington has the same issues that Auckland does of having to transport large amounts of stock through a city. Palmerston North is perfectly positioned to capitalise on that, and we're already seeing the benefits of the work that you're both putting in. I also want to say that I'm sure that our other economic development agencies across the country will appreciate your offer of support, particularly in the Hawke's Bay in light of the devastation we're seeing there. We've all seen the images of farms destroyed, businesses flooded, homes devastated. So I look forward to hearing where we can work in that space. I'll keep it brief and I'll move on to other comment. The Mayor.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Again, thanks. My thanks too to CEDA and some oversight for my colleagues on what on the projects and what you're doing. I just want to talk about the food side, and I think that's something that sometimes is a bit hard to actually. How do we pull those dots together? And having a strategy, I think, is one way, but I don't want to see the strategy sit like a document on a shelf that gains dust and actually what's real out of it. So I'll be looking forward to what the recommendations or the outcomes of that report are. One thing I think that goes into the tourism side as well is our New Zealand food experience or gallery that we could have here, showing off our long history in food. If you think about Rangitane and the food basket that was here, it attracted people here, but also, you know, places like the New Zealand Dairy Research Institute, which is Fonterra now. You know, they're 100 years old, or nearly 100 years old, and many other organisations as well. We are a diverse food producer here. We lead the country and actually, in some cases, the world in food science. And actually, we could actually go further and be a UNESCO city of cuisine, and that will help possibly draw those dots even closer together and do what the city and the wider region does best. On Te Utanganui, the Central New Zealand Distribution Hub, that's going to be, again, another thing that we absolutely do really, really well. And it's drawing those intermodal nodes together of rail, road and air. And I don't think there's any other place in New Zealand which they're all connected right next to each other. So again, you were hearing the themes of sustainability, and I absolutely agree that needs to be weaved through design, operations, and actually how we do things, but also internationalism. I look at what our other colleagues around the country are doing outside the metros, and we have a unique and a growing reputation in that international side, and it will fit definitely into food and actually into logistics and distribution as well. But I think concentrating and getting CETA to concentrate on what we're really good at rather than a very thin spread over everything is the right way to go. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Seeing no other speakers, we'll move to vote. And that has passed 15 votes for, none against. We'll now move to item 6, that the committee receive the report titled Summary Report on the Palmerston North Economic Structure of 22nd of February 2023, presented to our Economic Growth Committee. I'll welcome up Stacey Bell, our City Economist.
Great, thank you. Sorry, second time presenting to Council Committee here. Kia ora tātou councillors. It's a pleasure to be here this morning to present this report to you. I have prepared a short presentation just to summarise the key points of the research that was undertaken. Just prior to that though, I'd like to make a quick comment on the profiles, following up from questions that were asked of Jerry. We do economic profiles here and work closely with CETA to do that. We're currently reviewing what we do in that space. We may be looking to do more of a horizontal type analysis and then pull snapshots out of that to support inward investment. So that's something that's currently under consideration. The summary report is very much a summary report of a very large data source of about 2,000 lines spanning 22 years of data. So it is very much a summary report, but there are many opportunities to glean more data and information from that to support council decision making. So we'll come back to you with more detail on that in the future. Right. So it's very much a good news story actually for the Palmerston North economy, and having been working for Palmerston North City for about 6 months now, this was an incredibly useful research for me to undertake as well and to understand the actually very strong foundation of the Palmerston North economy and highly skilled occupations and businesses. So in terms of the period over COVID, so this is from the 1st of April basically through to the latest GDP data for September, the economy here grew 7.2% versus 5.1% for New Zealand, so that shows that strong economic foundation of the city relative to the national average. Of course, other things did influence that as well, such as less exposure to lockdowns, etc., and economic restrictions around COVID-19. However, the 5-year data also confirms that the economy here grew 16.7% over the last 5 years relative to 13.2% nationally. So that economic structure has really supported economic activity here, and we're getting good growth in those high-value sectors across the economy. So we have a large and diverse public sector. So around 32% or 32.7% of our GDP is generated from our very diverse public sector here, and around 37% of our employment. So that compares with 17% of GDP nationally and around 23% of employment. So that very large and diverse public sector has supported incomes, especially over challenging times when we've had impacts on household incomes and demand from other sectors. So that's really supported economic activity here. We've also got a very high value public and private industry, so a very highly skilled workforce here, and occupations, and those businesses or those industries are growing over all timeframes that I looked at, which was the 1 year, the 10-year and the 20-year. We have a higher proportion of our workforce, again, in highly skilled and skilled roles. Some of these are in the government sector, but outside that in the research institutes, etc. as well, and across our professional services, such as accountancy, all those services that support activity both here in the city and actually in the surrounding districts as well. And in terms of our contribution to the food ecosystem here, those services provide crucial services to our rural neighbours and food production across the wider region. So in terms of economic growth, it's very much been driven by our knowledge-intensive industries. Just a bit of a heads up on what knowledge-intensive industries are. They're defined as industries where 25% of the workforce has to have at least a level 7 qualification, and 30% of the workforce is employed in either professional, scientific, professional, occupations management roles. So that is the definition of knowledge-intensive industries, and we have a higher proportion of that here in the city than at the national level, more like a larger city type structure there in terms of our employment and occupations. Construction has also been a very strong growth sector for us, like much of New Zealand, at this period of time where we've had low interest rates and household income growth, and a large amount of investment flowing in from both central, local government and also the private sector. So that's really driven economic activity in the city. Because those incomes have been sustained, that has also driven demand across the rest of the economy. So we've sustained and even grown our expenditure across the economy, which has really driven growth in jobs and labour in the services sector, such as cafes, restaurants, retail, those sectors as well. I think the biggest challenge to these sectors actually has been getting enough staff to cope with the demand for their services, which has been a problem for some sectors across our economy. We do also have a very large business size here in terms of the average number of employees. So it's 6.8 compared with 4.2 employees on average for New Zealand. So those larger businesses do tend to be more resilient to economic shocks, which has also supported jobs and incomes and economic activity across the economy. Our strongest employment growth is in high-value services and occupations. So for me, coming in 6 months, it was very interesting for me to see this, because we often talk about it, but it's actually there in the data. These are the industries and occupations that are growing the most strongly across our economy. So I have put this very big graph here, and I don't expect you to read it, and I'm certainly not going to read it, but that's from the report, which details our GDP structure across all our sectors. Again, our public administration and safety, our government sector is very strong here. The largest sector is public administration safety, and within that, defence is the largest sector. Healthcare and social assistance, again, very large sector for our city, and those specialist services are growing in terms of our occupations as well. Construction, we've talked about, which has been very strong over the last 10 years actually, in particular the last 5. Wholesale trade, another one. We've talked about distribution, logistics and distribution, and this is very much a growth sector for our economy. Our professional, scientific and technical services was the highest growth sector, 49.3%, which is about 17% year on year, so it's very strong growth over the year. And within that, our scientific research services was the highest growth. Construction, house construction was very strong, but also road and bridge building GDP was very strong over that time frame. Wholesale trade also features there again in terms of being one of our biggest growth sectors. So our employment structure, again, our government sectors do dominate there in terms of healthcare and social assistance and education and training. One interesting insight from the data is the very strong increase in the number of early childhood education teachers that are employed in the city, up over 100 over the year. Often in periods like this, when we've got very low unemployment and strong demand for labour, we have people entering the workforce when they otherwise may not have done so, and quite often that is associated with a strong increase in early childhood education teachers. Again, highest growth sectors, construction, healthcare and social assistance, and accommodation and food services has really taken off again after the lockdowns and economic restrictions of 2020 and 2021. Employment by occupations. So at the bottom there, we do have knowledge-intensive employment. Now that is across sector, so that's not added to, that's just indicating that alongside sectoral employment as well. Interestingly, in the city, our professionals make up over 27% of our occupations. That's compared with 25% for New Zealand. So we have a much stronger base of professionals here in the city than what the national average is. Managers are slightly below. We do have a very strong community and personal service worker sector here, which is related directly to our resources and health. So we do have a very strong sector there, which is growing. Technician and trade workers, of course, this is across the country that we've seen strong growth. Very much our construction services, such as our trades here, is the biggest occupation growth there. So again, professionals up 376, very strong growth in that sector. Technicians and trade workers, again, across the country, but here, construction trade workers has grown very strongly. And specialist managers, actually project management and construction managers was the highest growth with it as a subsector of the management occupation group. So undertaking this research and applying that to Palmerston North economy, I can say I'm actually very optimistic. We do have some challenges out there in terms of the wider economic conditions that we're facing across the country and in fact across the globe. But we do have a very strong and solid foundation in high value public and private industry, and that will really support economic activity going forward. We do have that elevated investment that we've seen flow into the economy and will continue to do so. And one of the things that I think is very positive for our city is that we have a very strong growth in those high value sectors. So it's not something that is stalled, we're actually experiencing higher growth in those sectors than what we've seen before, which is very positive. The investment flowing into the region will also build on these core economic strengths as we go forward and face the unavoidable challenges that New Zealand is facing currently. Right, that's me.
Kia ora, thank you very much for your presentation. We'll now move to questions. Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Mr Chair, and thanks, Stacey. I've just got one question, just in terms of, there's some graphs there on page 16 and 19 of the report, which talks about both GDP and employment. There's some contraction there across in the public administration and safety category, even though it's like the biggest employer. Can you just perhaps, are we able to shed some light on that, some context around that?
Sorry, could you, I didn't quite understand the question.
Yeah, sorry. Page 16 and 19, there are some graphs in there which talks about GDP and employment. It shows that there is some contraction in the public administration and safety areas, so I just wonder if we could get some context around that, please.
Yeah, sure. So we had a contraction in central government administration activity over the year ended 2022. That would have been largely driven by things not going ahead that were planned to go forward because of economic restrictions around the light settings. Yeah, so that would have been why. I think there was a contraction there of about 7.7 million in GDP. Some of that was taken up by $4.4 million increase in GDP from the defence sector. So that was directly related to those economic restrictions as a result of COVID-19, and that was experienced across the country, actually, in most parts of the country over that period.
Councillor Finlay.
Yeah, in a way it's something similar to what Councillor Hancock was asking. Going back to page 15, there's a graph there which you also put up. It just got me a little bit, some of the comments on the side. You've got here government, education and health, 32.5%. 32.5% of what?
GDP.
Of GDP. Okay, so that makes it quite a large amount. But I look here, here you've got healthcare and social assistance, but that's 11.4. So does the government one come out of that? Is that not considered in that 11.4?
The healthcare and social assistance?
Yes.
That is part of that 32.5%. So that's included in that calculation.
That's included in the 32.5.
Yes.
Okay. And when you've got public administration and safety, could you be a little bit, could you open that statement up a little bit more? What is public administration and safety? Is that just council or is it government or what is it?
Yeah, it's a range of industries. So at the broader level, it is central government administration, so all central government activities here in the city. It's local government administration, it is police, it is security services.
Okay.
It includes the defence sector as well.
Okay. Thank you.
And also, I think it also, in terms of representatives here from other countries, etc., that sort of thing as well. So
that's quite a big area.
Representation.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Councillor McCullough.
Thanks, Mr Chair, and thanks, Stacey, for the report. Having read it, I'm also optimistic about the city's future. I think, I mean, it's a good report. One question that I probably have is that you've provided a snapshot of what the housing, the construction industry is looking like, but the report is a little bit silent on the housing market and also consent approval within the city. So it would have been good to kind of get that snapshot as well, or an overview of that. So are you able to sort of give us a bit of context around that? What the housing market is currently looking like in Palmerston North and the state of consent approval as well, if possible?
So consents have definitely softened. So they're around 397 to the year end of January. From our peak in over the year 2021 year, it has fallen back. It was over 500 at that point. On a historical, comparing with historically, it is still quite high. We're doing an analysis at the moment to understand how many of those houses actually become dwellings on the ground. So we're doing a bit of research around that. So we're looking at abandonment rates, etc., which are actually very low for the city from what we can see. So yes, we do expect investment in housing to soften. We're definitely seeing signs of that across the economy, as is every part of New Zealand at this point in time. Latest data from REINZ around the median house price falls 11.7% over the year for Palmerston North. So we did see quite a strong fall toward the end of last year. I think there was a lot of concern with the data coming out and what that meant for inflation and interest rates, which did see quite a decline, a sharp decline that wasn't actually anticipated at that point. But now we're seeing that sort of levelling off a little bit. We're still seeing softening house prices, just not at the rate that we were. It is something we're definitely keeping a very close eye on. And we'll come back to you with the quarterly economic update in the next meeting to provide more information.
Sure, that'd be great. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Did have a couple questions. Thanks, Stacey, for the report. Firstly, just around the comparators. So there is some information in there around Palmerston North versus New Zealand. Just what would you see as a possibly more relevant comparator than just a whole of country?
I always like the Dunedin comparison, especially when we're talking about the Manawatu region in particular, because they have a very strong rural economy as well as a very high value service sector economy like Palmerston North as well. In terms of Palmerston North per se, it's a little bit more difficult, and that's because we have such a large public sector here relative to most other cities of similar size. So there is a little bit of difficulty there, but I'm still searching. So I will continue searching for a better comparator. But in terms of the region, definitely Dunedin.
Thanks. So do we have access to the kind of raw data that we would need if we wanted to make a kind of provincial cities index type thing that we wanted to benchmark or at least compare against?
We absolutely do. We've recently procured the Infometrics database, which provides TA level data at about 504 industries across the country, so we can definitely do that across occupations, employment and GDP. So we can definitely do that.
Excellent, thank you. Second question is around what we can measure too, I suppose, ultimately, but historically there's been quite a strong link, let's say, between economic activity and emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions. Are we in a position to start to test whether that link is softening or changing over time?
I definitely think that we are in a position to look at that. In terms of historically, there is work to be done around that space, but I definitely think we are, and I think it would be great to see that decoupling towards economic activity in terms of GDP and our emissions, definitely. We do have a strong economic basis for that decoupling because of our strengths are in the high value sectors, which tend to have less emissions associated with them, and also, I guess, progress within the logistics and distribution sector around using renewable energy, etc. So there's plenty of opportunities and a solid foundation for doing that. I am talking to our climate change team at the moment about undertaking those types of calculations. So we'll come back to you with more information on that.
Great, thank you. Finally, can I just ask, do we have any ways of getting at how local an economy is? And I know localness of an economy is kind of a sometimes nebulous term, but to me there's quite a difference in a dollar that stays in Palmerston North versus a dollar that goes to, an offshore bank's bottom line profits, for instance.
Absolutely.
Do we have ways of getting at localness?
We do have indications of localness. So we have data within our Market View series which looks at loyalty and the amount of the spend that is retained within Palmerston North versus flowing outside Palmerston North. So we don't have one absolute indicator, but we have a number of different indicators that we can use to estimate that. We also have import-output models which provide an understanding of imports and exports that come in and flow out of the city as well. So that, again, it's not an absolute, it's not a perfect indicator, but it does provide some understanding.
Is that something that you see then as a kind of natural progression of reporting that you might bring to council, or kind of how does that fit in your approach to your role, I suppose?
Very much fits within my idea of my role, and definitely want to transition or want to evolve to be providing that sort of information alongside these types of reports. It's always a bit of a challenge when you're working with so much data to get the level of detail right, because there is just so much information. So it is something that we're working on at the moment, but certainly we have those import-output models and we can provide that information, and I would like to do so moving forward.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I might ask a question building off Councillor Barrett's line around the trade-offs between growth and other factors. We all know that there's quite a positive story in terms of growth here, but there's quite a harrowing story in terms of inflation across New Zealand. In your opinion, is the growth that our city is experiencing driving inflation in our city, or is that inflation being driven primarily from external factors, national and international?
I believe that the inflation is being driven at the domestic and international level. So Palmerston North, yeah, there will be, in the sense that we have never had more people employed in the city. People are earning money, and even though the cost of living and mortgage rates are rising strongly, people still have money to spend. And that's playing out in our Market View data when we see that spending across the city is actually continuing to grow. And that's because we do have such a strong economy. But that is the case across most parts of New Zealand, and that is what is driving the inflation, as well as those international pressures which have waned somewhat now, but domestically we have a lot of inflationary pressures made worse by terrible storms, and that's going to flow through to our economy as well. So it's an interesting time for the RBNZ. The OCR announcement is out this afternoon. I will be watching with bated breath. It is an interesting time for them, and very much a time of trade-offs. Getting that inflation under control, but all these external forces that are driving that inflation that actually cannot be influenced by the OCR. So, yeah, interesting times for the domestic economy.
Thank you. The Mayor.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Stacey. Another excellent report, and I think it shows the value, colleagues, to having an economist on council, but we'll say more about that in comments. Stacey, talking about you just spoke about the Reserve Bank and just influencing influences. Stats New Zealand. I met with the Chief Stat, Mark Snowden, last week, and it's evident. I'm just thinking, where do you fit in, and where does the city give some information, some data to them? Because they have sometimes a bit of a different data set than what we have internally, and even some of the things that you've presented to us today. Do you talk to them?
We do, but not enough.
Right.
Yeah, it is a relationship we would like to build further. We do have additional data, Stats New Zealand. We are a data taker from Stats New Zealand. We use a lot of their data, but we also use a lot of other sources as well to get a more in-depth idea of what's happening in the city in particular. So it is a relationship that needs to be built on further.
Great. That's what I told them that we would possibly be doing, so I'm glad you've reinforced that. Thank you.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Stacey, for your report. I think mine's probably just a bigger picture question, maybe. The report's very positive, leans heavily into lag indicators. Obviously, that's what the data is. But as we're coming into, I think your report talks in the conclusion about the next couple of years will continue to be a challenge. We're leaning on some of those positive lag indicators to make us feel good about coming into that. But if things aren't as positive as we're thinking, where would we see the first signs of that in the indicators coming through? What would be the lead indicators for a shift in that climate?
Definitely unemployment. with the Reserve Bank is actually trying to engineer a softening in economic conditions, which means driving up unemployment to some extent. So that would be one. The stats on unemployment for the city are out tomorrow. So unfortunately, I don't have them today, but they are out tomorrow. One of the early indicators too is investment in durable items like cars. You know, expensive household and business items like commercial vehicles. That's another one that we watch quite closely. And also spending across the city. And it's a bit of a balancing act at the moment because we want to drive inflation down, and that means a softening in spending across all of New Zealand. But at the same time, that's what drives incomes and growth in our service sectors as well. So it is always a trade-off in under these types of economic conditions. But yeah, they would be the lead ones that we look at for an early indication of a softening in economic conditions.
Thank you. That tells us where to look next time. Thanks.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr Chair. Thanks, Stacey, for the report. A couple of questions. The first one is just about the community and voluntary sector, which I guess by definition doesn't fall into this type of report because the GDP is only on employed, is it? Or is it covered somewhere in your report?
It is covered in the community healthcare and social assistance sector. So these models are based on expenditure across sectors. That's how the GDP is estimated, so it is included within that.
Okay. Are you able to give an estimate of the contribution of the community and voluntary sector to the GDP then, locally?
To be completely honest with you, I do not have the information with me, but we do have the information available, so I can provide that to you.
Okay, thank you. That would be great. And then my second question is really I guess around some competing narratives that we're hearing. So on the one hand, we're hearing that we've never had more people employed, that people have got money to spend, that spending is continuing to grow, that the GDP of the region is doing well, etc. On the other hand, we're also hearing that we need to tighten our belts, that people are hurting, that people are struggling. We're aware that interest rates on mortgages are increasing and therefore housing costs are increasing. So, I mean, given those two competing narratives, I mean, where do we come out on the ledger of trying to weigh those two different stories up?
Absolutely. And quite often we talk about aggregates in economics, so overall things are going well. There are sectors of our communities that are doing it really, really tough. And definitely never want to underplay that because families are doing it incredibly tough. Our rental price index was out yesterday, which showed very strong increases in rental prices still. So those increasing costs are really impacting on lower income families in particular, young families, or any family that has bought a property over the last 18 months with minimum deposit that is now paying up to $500, $800 more a fortnight or a week on mortgages. So yes, those people are doing it very, very tough. And that's always the difficulty with using monetary policy because you can't discriminate and it doesn't impact on everyone. So people who don't have a mortgage aren't going to be reducing their spending on the basis of that. So it's basically winners and losers, unfortunately. And some people are hit far harder. And that is something to be aware of when we think of these economic conditions, is that there are those people that will need additional support. Yeah.
Thank you.
Councillor Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Thanks, Stacey, for the positive report. And I was just to follow on from Councillor Johnson's, the effect on our communities that are feeling that pain. But my view would be, and I'm happy for it to be challenged on this, is that successive governments have played around in the financial markets and from the economy's point of view without the regard to those communities who, 10 years ago there was a small sector of our
Councillor
communities
Fitzgerald,
using
what's
food
your
banks.
question?
Sorry?
What's your question, Councillor Fitzgerald?
Do you have a view, Stacey, on when our central government and local governments are going to start paying more attention to the pain that our socio-economic communities are facing as a result of all these economist projections, particularly with today's OCR heading north?
I do believe there's a very different role for monetary policy versus fiscal policy. So government and local government have to work closely to try and mitigate the people who pay the cost of these broader policies, like monetary policy and the OCR. It's so difficult. The resources needed to mitigate the impacts are huge. I feel like I'm moving into a political view here as opposed to an economic one. I believe, personally as an economist, I believe that what drives our economy is healthy communities and healthy people. So that is an investment that I believe needs to be made at the government level.
Thanks, Stacey. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Finlay.
Yeah, thank you for letting me have a second bite. Councillor Barrett reminded me of something I picked up and was going to ask and I totally forgot. You have in your graphs, transport, postal and warehousing, and you have retail trade, so you know the difference there. But I would be interested in seeing one of the biggest growing things in the city is courier deliveries. I'd love to know how much that has grown each year, because that's business that has gone out of the city, especially overseas. Is it possible to possibly have a look at the amount of courier deliveries we have in the city on a regular basis?
The data we do have is around the number of people employed in that sector and the economic activity generated from that sector. So I could definitely have a look and see if I can find any data around delivery numbers.
It'd be interesting to see the growth in that area, because it's actually a growth in that area is a decline in the retail area, isn't it?
Yeah. We have seen very strong growth across both our retail and wholesale trade sectors actually in the last 2 years, which is very interesting to see. And these are real numbers, so they're not influenced by inflation. So very strong growth in both of those. So I'll have a look into that.
Thank you very much.
Might be last this time. Councillor McCullagh.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry to jump back in the queue. Thanks, Stacey, again. Just following up on one of the questions that Councillor Johnson actually asked earlier regarding the voluntary sector, and you covered it quite beautifully. But I was also reading Auckland City Council's economic snapshot, what's going on, and I was very interested to see how they have an overview of Maori development and businesses and also migrant businesses and development in there. Would you have a snapshot of what they might look like or any figures around that?
We do have figures around Māori business. Currently we don't have figures around migrant businesses in the city. Certainly an area that would be interesting or very useful to look at, considering the diversity of our community here. So I will have a look. It's amazing where you can find data. So yeah, we can have a look and see what we can find around.
I'll be happy to have this. Thanks.
The Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and kia ora, Stacey, thank you for your report. In the conclusion, you state the diverse economic base with a solid foundation and a high-value public and private industry has driven the growth in the areas. I just wanted to ask a question. Do you think there's an opportunity for more diversity within our local community that we're not tapping?
Potentially there is. I would say that when you have an agglomeration of resources in particular sectors like we do in the public sector, then you have, that's a point of strength for your economy. Other sectors are generated from that, service support sectors that support that large industry base. So it's a bit of a trade-off between diversity and comparative advantage or particular strength in particular industries. Now, I do think we have both here in the city. So we do have particular strength in our public and administration sector in particular, but we also have a lot of services that have been generated from our strength in that sector. We've also had a lot of professional services that have been generated from the strength of our surrounding districts and food production and primary production as well. So that's where we're part of a very strong ecosystem there for food production, and also which flows on also to our research strength here in the city. Actually interesting for our research scientific services, we often use something called location quotient as a measure of comparative advantage, and that is basically just the percentage of your workforce employed in that sector relative to the national percentage of the workforce employed in that sector, and we have 4.7 times more resources or people employed in that sector than using that measure at the national level. So it's a point of particular growth for us. So it's a bit of a yes and. I do agree with you that there is more opportunity for further diversity, but we do have that very diverse service sector as well that has been built up around our strengths in particular areas of the economy.
Oh, thank you, Stacey. And the final one, if I've got this right, you inferred the growth in early childhood services and staffing appears to correlate to some of the employment growth. Is there any strategy we could apply to support and encourage the EC sector?
That's a very, very good question. I'm personally not familiar with any of the challenges that they're facing, but it's certainly something that we could be looking at to understand those challenges and how council could influence or support them.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. That's reached the end of our list of questions. Thank you, Stacey. You can return to your seat.
Thank you.
I will move that the committee receive this report, and I look to the Mayor as my seconder. I'm not going to sit here and repeat what's just been said. We've all read the report, we've all seen the statistics, and it does paint a very promising picture for our region, but it is important that we recognise, as was highlighted through questioning, the trade-offs of this kind of sustained high levels of economic growth, particularly around inflation, but also around, as Councillor Barrett pointed out, carbon emissions and the infrastructure required to service this growth. So it is good to have that information with us to guide our decision making as we move into our annual budget and long-term planning. The Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, councillors, I think it's the value of having we've just witnessed the value of a really diverse economy and report on that. And I'd have to say an absolutely excellent report and the value of having a very, very good economist on council. So thank you, Stacey. It was awesome, and I think you answered some quite challenging questions very, very well. We saw the real value of having a highly skilled workforce and the value of our, and to get a highly skilled workforce, you've got to train them, and having the value of Massey and our other tertiary institutions, and acknowledge Te Pūkenga here today, but also IPU, and other trainers. Also, those growing industries, and it was interesting to see, education's always been a mainstay of the city, but also healthcare. But we're seeing construction and those government services, although they have contracted in some places, they're still significant numbers in construction. But also we can't forget the agribusiness. And I went to Hawke's Bay yesterday and saw firsthand what's happening up there. And I'd have to say our economy is underpinned and feeds into the city economy from our agribusiness and agricultural primary sectors as well. A couple of the questions that were asked around, is there two economies going on? Absolutely there is, and I think we all know that. There's the haves and there's the have-nots, and we need to be mindful of that as when we make some decisions going forward. But also good to see that our officers are linking in with CEDA, because I was a little bit concerned that we might be having duplications happening at times, and good to see that they are not only sitting together, but they're working together as well. But finally, I think it's around influencing some of our influencers. I would have never have thought that we might have to start influencing the Reserve Bank, but I do hope they are cautious on what they do today, because whatever they do will have quite an impact on what happens in the future. But also our government and what they do with their spending. Stats New Zealand, I do think we've got some work to do there, and acknowledge, Stacey, that you and perhaps some other officers will have some discussions with them, because they have clearly quite a different view of who we are than what we do with our internal numbers. And finally, what are we going to do with all this data and information? It's really great, but actually I do think there is some benchmarking that we need to do where we sit in this country of ours, and perhaps not only against other cities but other sectors as well. So some officers may remember, even some councillors, we used to have a core cities set of data that used to come out. And I was doing a clean out the other day and I found our last report. And I do wonder if there is a re-injection of that required, and that's around cities like Dunedin, possibly Whangarei, Northland and others, that Hamilton, Tauranga, etc., that we can benchmark where we're going with things. But overall, a great report, but yeah, as I said in my State of the City, there is some challenges and headwinds coming, but I think we're well placed to face them. Thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Yeah, as others have commented, was quite pleased with this report. I think it's got a lot of good information and is showing what we can do with that information in terms of starting to help us shape some decisions, some big decisions that we do have coming, both for the council and for the wider city to think about. Was really heartened to see the hundreds of new businesses starting up and knowing that's going well, and a lot of the other data in there. It's also really appreciated getting some long-run analysis. I know it's something that I've questioned a number of times, is the value of snapshots if we can't see trends, and this was nice to see some trend data actually coming into this report, and hope that we can continue that approach. Was also very heartened by the answers in terms of being able to build in some localness indicators to start to look at, to the extent that we are decoupling emissions and economic activity, and as the Mayor said, a more relevant comparator data set. Always interested in how we're going against whole of New Zealand, but really we need to be making sure that we're benchmarking against peers as well. So really looking forward to seeing this reporting mechanism evolve over time. It's a really valuable lens for us to work through. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Finlay.
Yeah, again, a very good report, and I enjoyed it, and I had a good look through it earlier in the week. But one of the things that occurred to me, and I sort of touched on it a little bit with the couriers, there's a lot of information here, but a lot of information we don't get, and we couldn't ask for everything. But one of the examples that I'd like to bring up is we've got a lot of healthcare and social assistance, but there's a growing area within that, probably stuck in that area, which is aged care. If you went to some of the villages we have in town and you say it's healthcare and social assistance, a lot of the people living there would totally disagree with that, because that's where they live, that's their environment, that's their village. They don't see it as healthcare. I would love to be able to see stats, if we can ever get them, on the growth in aged care within the city. It is something that is growing rapidly, as you can see by numbers, and the waiting list and everywhere is huge. That is something I think we could look at, because there's quite a future for Palmerston North in that area. I'd just like to mention that.
That's the end of our speaking, so in that case we will vote. That is passed 15 votes for and none against. We will move to item 7. I am conscious that we have a number of people here waiting for a morning tea at 10:30, so we'll see how much we get through before morning tea, because we will break at 10:30. So item 7, a recommendation to Council that Council adopt the Palmerston North Strategic Networks 2023 as detailed in attachments 1 to 3 as a key strategic document to give or to guide future decision-making and investment prioritisation. And I welcome Vanuka, and I note former Senior Transport Manager, up to speak. Thank you for coming in today.
Yeah, just through you, Mr. Chair, and Morena Koutou councillors, just to clarify what the Chair's just said, Vanuka Naniakara is our Senior Transport Planner. He completed these reports in that role. Unfortunately for us, Vanuka finished up with us last week, but has kindly offered to come back and present the reports today. So we're sad to see Vanuka moving on, but we're also pleased that he's moving on to a role at Waka Kotahi, where he will have a key role in helping us with the implementation of Pinity. So Vanuka's moved into a role which is Regional System Design Lead, Central North Island. He tells me that translates to Principal Transport Planner. So And he's got some colleagues here from the Regional Council in Waka to assist with the presentation. So.
Cool. Kia ora tātou. I will take the report as read, but I will highlight that what we're presenting here is a nationally consistent Waka Kotahi transport planning framework. It seeks to consolidate existing work programs. It's not intended to, present new interventions or projects or programs. It's traditionally a document that's done in the background, hidden behind council doors. What the intent of bringing it to council, creating a web map, creating a 101 document that you see in the attachments is to bring transparency and accountability to council, and to sort of daylight our transport planning processes and prioritisation processes. It also highlights where trade-offs occur based on our existing work program and how they need to be resolved in future. I've also got Adrienne Duffy from Waka Kotahi as the lead strategic planner, and Mark Reid from the Horizons Regional Council, manager transport services, I believe. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Vanuka. I might kick off our questioning by asking a bit about the origins of this and what elected member input has there been into forming this strategy?
The origins of this, effectively this is the first cab off the rank in terms of the P90I program. It's the first action within the program which was endorsed by the Waka Kotahi board and the previous council here. In terms of elected member input, this is very much a consolidation of our existing work program. So effectively, all of the plans and strategies that you see in one of the figures, figure 2, the intent is that this document consolidates all of that into one place.
If I could just add to that too, through you, Mr. Chair, one of the things I'd like to emphasise, and Vanuka's touched on it, is that the council does not make any transport decisions in isolation. So there are a world of transport decisions, and I've said this point a number of times in this chamber, there are a world of transport decisions that are made outside of this chamber by the Regional Council, Waka Kotahi, the government. So I think the decisions we make around our transport network are very different to the decisions we make, for instance, in terms of the way we make decisions on parks and reserves or libraries. We're operating within a framework where the majority of transport planning decisions are made outside of this chamber. So there are a significant number of documents identified on page 32 of this report. I'll quickly summarise through those. The GPS, the National Land Transport Plan, the Regional Land Transport Plan, there's also the Regional Land Public Passenger Transport Plan. We have a Strategic Transport Plan. We have a Palmerston North Integrated Spatial Plan. We have an Asset Management Plan. We have Pinity, which was endorsed by this council last year and also endorsed by Waka Kotahi. That is the key, decision-making document that's driving the content of the information within this report. We have our Urban Cycle Network Master Plan, and as Vanuka's report shows, the Strategic Networks is the document that falls out of all of those. So the horse hasn't just left the stables, it is a long way around the track. So I guess to assist with your question, Mr. Chair, and Vanuka's response is that in terms of input, there is a range of input across a long period of time through a variety of documents, and I appreciate some of those are new or haven't been seen by some elected members. So I just put that lens over, I guess, the questions and comments that will follow on this item.
Thank you, David. A follow-up then that's possibly best directed at you is, how does this interact with the approximately $10 million of funding we approved in last week's council meeting from Waka Kotahi, if this weren't to go through?
This won't affect that decision, but I think that, Vanuka is putting his hand up, so I'm to answer that one.
I will say, so I don't want to speak for my future employer, but I don't anticipate this decision having any implication on that funding. However, I will highlight that the funding that we've received, one of the preconditions for all 3 applications was the presence of this work, and we indicated that this work was in draft.
Thank you. And my final question pertains to page 123. which outlines some of the actions that we'll be taking in the medium term. The removal and rationing of all on-street parking in the walkable city areas, and the removal or rationing of all on-street parking on routes prioritised, or on our arterial routes. So I want to understand if I'm correct in my thinking that endorsing this would endorse the rationing or removal of parking in the square, down Broadway Avenue, George Street, Coleman Mall, Cuba Street, Queen Street, King Street, Tremaine Avenue, Fitzherbert Avenue, Main Street East, Rangatiki Street and Pioneer Highway. Is that what we are endorsing here today?
No. What you're endorsing is the process and platform that we use to present our strategic transport decision making. So effectively what this has highlighted over the last 2 years is that there's a lot more work that needs to be done. This in isolation doesn't propose any particular intervention. What it does is highlight if there is a strategic desire to do something on the network, what are the other implications that we need to consider?
Thank you. Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the report, Vanuka, and good to see all this work coming into one place. I'm interested to see how that hangs together. Probably a couple of questions around the impact of this. I saw in your figure 2, which refers to the network operating plan, which is a Waka Kotahi requirement. Sorry if this puts you in a difficult spot with your 2 hats on, but what's the time frame on the NOP being in place?
So point of clarification, I think the network operating plan is what is being presented here. What we've called it is the strategic networks because it means more to most people, I think. But effectively, this is the network operating plan.
And what's Waka Kotahi's expectation about the time frame for that being in place?
I think it will be dependent on the timeframes for us proposing programs and interventions for the Regional Land Transport Plan to be then funded by the National Land Transport Fund. I could be wrong, but I think it's sometime later this year, maybe August or September.
Do you want me to talk to that?
Yep, please.
So just in terms of that overall process and how councils may feed into a regional council process and then go through, similar to your LTP processes, council needs to secure funding if they wish to have Waka Kotahi funding, both through the RLTP and having this in place, this piece of work in place would be supportive of that, I guess, overall investment story for the city and its transport network, and to be able to really make that case for a greater level of investment across the transport network. So in short, in line with your LTP process, if you wanted to see funding, say, delivered from middle of 2024 onwards in that period.
Okay, thank you. And my second question was about the relationship with Pinati. And thank you, David, for your comments about how all these things hang together. I suppose my concern here is if there's, is there any risk to Pinati in any delay to this work? What's the implications of tying these 2 things together?
I think that's very much dependent on kind of the point that Mark made in terms of getting our programs and projects into the prioritisation list, I guess. We're coming up to the pointy end of getting our projects in and effectively making sure that the strongest case for investment is presented, particularly at a time where Waka Kotahi didn't have much capital across the country a month ago and probably has much less now. Anything we can get in and the strongest case for investment helps.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just and thanks, Vanuka, and other colleagues there. And I'll put this nicely, but as a jockey, and I'm using the general manager's language there, who hasn't actually been on any of these horses. I'm just trying to get an understanding where we actually have fed into this, because the devil's in the detail, and there's some quite far-reaching assumptions here. If this is just ticked off and whitewashed, and it all happens, where have we fed in?
I would say through the preceding documents, so in terms of the signing off of the asset management plans, signing off of the Palmerston North Integrated Transport Initiative, PNITI, our strategic transport plan, and our feedback into the RLTP, the current RLTP.
So all of this comes from, if you look at item 7 and page 32, obviously it's all based on the GPS of the government of the day. Is that right? And that feeds in, well, it's on your slide, so...
Yeah, effectively the GPS, I wouldn't say dictate, it probably influences how the National Land Transport Fund is divided up. Okay. I guess that is our governing document, and so effectively if that does change, I guess our investment prioritisation down at the local level would change as well. I guess the benefit in having all these different rungs on the ladder in place is that we're able to pivot regardless of how the GPS may or may not change. And so if there is a higher priority for different types of investment, having done the analysis and build the evidence up in many different ways to be able to then kind of pivot and basically present a equally strong case for investment is beneficial.
So just a couple of further questions, Mr. Chair. So on figure 2 and just underneath that, and again the devil's in the detail, so, and I understand we are trying to change things around public transport, walking and cycling, etc. But general traffic now has moved to number 5, and if you see what focuses through the report, we will be eventually carless if we continue on this report. I'm just trying to think where our farming community and our logistics and our distribution community, which make up about 65% of the city's economy, and we've just heard that from the previous speakers, what do we say to those industries? Are they welcome to Palmerston North, or...?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the list that you're referring to, I believe the list that you're referring to, isn't in any particular priority. What we're trying to say with the routes or the strategic networks is where we would highlight or prioritise or actively prioritise a certain type of use on a certain road. So that doesn't mean that if a particular route is red or green, that is the exclusive mode. What it would mean is if it came to a point where trade-offs needed to be made, then we would use this information in the strategic networks as a bit of a guide to highlight, okay, well, at this particular location, this mode would have priority over others. So in the case of public transport, that would involve perhaps just a bus priority light, for example, to let the buses go first, or in terms of walking and cycling, perhaps wider footpaths and that sort of thing. It doesn't mean that one or two modes exclusively have right-of-way.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Vanuka.
Thank you. Just keeping in mind that we've got a number of people here for morning tea, I think we'll break the meeting now, given there's a number of people in line for questions, and it's an important discussion we need to have. So we'll pause the meeting now, and we will return in half an hour. Yep, and we'll return at 11. All righty, thank you very much, everyone. We'll carry on where we left off. The Mayor, you've finished your line of questioning? I'll take that as a yes. Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Mr Chair, and thanks, Venuka. Look, just a very brief question. This is a very complex piece of work, and it's, I guess, this report really is the bringing together of a whole lot of different strands of the same thing, which have got quite clearly different implications from that, which flows from the detail. So I just wondered if, and I know that there's been various pieces of consultation, but because this is all being brought together into one piece of work, can I get a view in terms of consultation with the public to perhaps get some more answers around some of the implications in detail? Thank you.
I can attempt to, I think. Because this is effectively a summarisation of things that have already been consulted on, and also because it's not directly proposing any interventions out of this piece of work, any of the work program in terms of delivery of capital works or maintenance and operations, all that sort of stuff, they will have their own engagement and consultation processes. For example, one of the reports coming up later this morning is around the Main Street cycleway. That would effectively have been guided by this piece of work, which is in part then guided further upstream by the Urban Cycle Network Master Plan. So what this is doing really is just presenting a platform in which all of our transport planning decision making is presented in one consolidated format, and that there's transparency across the short, medium and long term. Any future work that happens in the transport planning space in terms of consolidation of, is it this road or that road, or if it's a new road, or if the colour of a route changes, that will be updated in this platform. However, in terms of any actual interventions happening on the ground, it'll have all those projects will have their own processes.
Yes, I suppose, but I guess my read of the report is that when we bring all of those pieces of work together, we suddenly crystallise a whole lot of things which may not necessarily be palatable for various parts of our community. So I just wonder if we could think about how we take the community with us on this journey, because we all understand that this work has to be done, but I just really want to get a flavour in terms of how we actually take the community with us on this journey. Thank you.
Through you, Mr Chair, one thing that's been going through my mind, I guess, in the last day or two in relation to this work is, and a potential opportunity to build on your question is, as you'll know, we have a process about to kick off to prepare a whole lot of new strategies and plans to support the LTP. One of those, under the 2018 and 2021 LTP and strategy and plan models, had a strategic transport plan. That document has been a largely word-based document. So certainly through the upcoming LTP process, I think there's an opportunity for the organisation to reflect on the way in which that document particularly is prepared, to take the material within here and use that as a way of more socialising this piece of work, because I think there's a spatial, excuse me, there's a strong spatial element to the information that's prepared, but a lot of our strategies and plans had shifted towards more of a word-based document. So that's one opportunity coming up where we could take this material, put it into that transport plan, or whatever it ends up being called as part of the LTP, and there'd be some broader socialisation along those lines.
And can I add to that? I guess that was the intent of developing a web map. So effectively that's something that sits on the website and enables us to better have those conversations with our communities around, well, if you sign up to kind of the wider strategic transport planning context, this is what it may look like on the ground. And it's just setting up those tools for us to be able to then, as a council, communicate what those actually mean, rather than that kind of word-based format that David just mentioned, highlighting that there are trade-offs that need to be made regardless of what the context is.
Yeah, thanks, Vinika and David. Mr. Chair, I'll await other questions. Thank you.
Councillor Finlay.
Yeah, thank you. I heard what you said to the Mayor when you were talking about the list on page 32. I have marked down here to ask you a similar type question. Initially, when I looked at that, and I thought, oh my goodness, you're putting cycling ahead of everything else, and you're putting walking ahead of general traffic. To me, the first thing I thought, well, you haven't even considered people with disabilities, you haven't considered older people. Maybe put your list a little bit differently than that, because someone reading that, now this is public, would say, oh, there's your priorities, because you got 1, 2, 3, 4. Maybe you just put a list of these other categories without numbering them, because I know myself as an older person, I looked at that and thought, what about the old people? Initially, I think that was, could you change that somehow before it gets any further?
Noted. I'll take advice on that from David. I guess throughout this piece of work, there's been no prioritisation of those modes across in kind of expense of any other mode.
Yeah.
What the piece of work does is highlight that, for example, some of the roads in the city centre within the inner ring road would be prioritised for walking, and that includes people of all abilities, in the same way that we would probably not treat Tremaine Avenue, for example, in the same way that we would want to treat George Street. David, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just to clarify, page 32, the items listed 1 to 5 are not listed in priority of modes. So this is a committee report. The document attached is the strategic networks. I'd need to go and check that, whether they're bullet pointed or numbered. If they were numbered within there, we could change them to bullet points.
Yeah.
The priority is actually about that, where those routes are identified within the strategic networks. Freight is the priority on a particular route, not that freight is more important than cycling in general.
Just looking at it that way just brought that to my attention straight away. So if you could alter it, it'd be quite good.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Vinika, for the report. Just seeking to understand where this plan fits in with the sort of hierarchy of planning instruments regarding transport generally, and how, my understanding from my work as an RMA Commissioner is that our planning documents need to align with all the other planning instruments. We don't have scope for doing something radically different, do we? Could you explain that?
Yeah, I think it's in our best interest to align with our nationally consistent transport planning approaches. Effectively, across the country, all councils are competing for the same pots of money, and I guess sitting on Wakatahi's end, it makes it a lot easier to prioritise councils for funding that have done, I guess, that work and have demonstrated that there's a strong evidence base to the investments that they're proposing. What this does is effectively align us to, I guess, that process. It's taking on all the work that we have done, council has done in the past, and everything that's been signed up to or endorsed, and just basically presenting it in one sort of consolidated vision. So the presence of this sort of work is really key to ensuring that we can maximise our co-funding in future and actually make sure that we can get our fair share.
Okay, thank you. And then in terms of consultation with elected members, I do recall 2 workshops in the conference and function centre upstairs last term that were quite lengthy about this type of planning. Can you talk about those, perhaps for the benefit of the new councillors who weren't at those?
Yeah, thanks. Basically, we ran a couple of sessions around Transport Planning 101 for the previous council, and a lot of, I'd say the bulk of the work that was presented in those workshops directly fed into this work, and some of the consultants that that assisted us with those workshops developed the work that you see in front of you as well. So it's all been part of the same engagement, so same tranche of work. Ultimately, transport planning is very complex, and regardless of what the context is, there's always trade-offs that need to be made across the network. I think officers would support the ability to kind of take the elected members through that journey, because some of those decisions to prioritise one mode over the other can be difficult and complex. So, but this sort of work really enables us to have that stronger, more robust conversation, and lifts, I guess, plans that are more word-focused into something that actually is tangible on the ground.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, if I could add to that, just during the break, I received a message from the Regional Director for Waka Kotahi, who's watching this meeting online, and has offered to effectively sort of have a session with the elected members on planning, transport planning and investment.
Yeah, I suppose my question was, David, we've already had a couple of those sessions, haven't we, last term? Have we not?
We have, but I appreciate this is a new council and a new term, and it appears as though there's a willingness from Waka Kotahi to work with us in terms of, a broader session on transport planning and investment.
Thank you. Thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Vanuka, for the report, and thanks to many elected members for crossing a lot of the questions off my list. A couple things, I guess, still there. I think one is I'm really trying to get a firm understanding of timeframes. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we've established that we need one of these before we're going to see much by way of inbound investment against penalty. So what kind of time envelope do we actually have to consider?
It's a difficult question to answer, because I think where this council sits in the status quo is effectively this sort of work has never been used to feed into our investment prioritisation and I guess building our programs to then go to Waka Kotahi for co-investment. And so there is a sort of decision to be made around, well, we can, I guess, stick to our status quo, but I guess the alternative approach is to have this work, I guess, endorsed and in train to feed into the imminent and ongoing conversations around the 24-27 NLTP investment program. So I guess in terms of feeding into that process, I hear it's sort of this year, mid this year. And to be fair, conversations are already happening around our Road to Zero program, which started towards the middle of last year. And so having this piece of work would really supplement the conversations that already have been had and are already ongoing with Waka Kotahi.
Thanks. Would I be reasonable to summarize from that if we want this to help us gain traction in that funding round, we have 3 to 6 months?
I guess that's a difficult question to answer, because ultimately we're requesting funding from the same pots of cash that every other council, including the tier ones, are requesting cash for. So it really is a decision around, do we want to, I guess, spend that 3 to 6 months making sure that our existing transport planning context is still fit for purpose, with the implication that we may have to defer programs to the next NLTP 2731, because we may not get in line quickly enough, I guess.
And thank you. And thinking about going effectively head-to-head with other councils for resource, do most other small to medium cities have one of these in their pocket already that they're using
So that's a great question. So this piece of work is not so subtly inspired by the work that's been done by my colleagues up in Auckland Transport. There are varying types of this piece of work being done by a whole bunch of councils, Tier 1s, 2 and 3. A lot of this work is hidden in the back end, and my desire with this piece of work is to daylight this, to make sure that there's obviously transparency and accountability from both council, but then also from Wakasahi and our other partners like Horizons to actually proceed at pace with things that we've planned.
Can I just add to that, from a Waka Kotahi perspective, we're having this conversation with multiple other councils and encouraging our partners to think strategically and long-term about the decisions and the frameworks that they use to make those decisions. And it's a difficult decision, but we are encouraging councils to have that upfront as they make their investment bids for the NLTP, because there are a number of other funds that are there in their background, like the SURF funding for climate change response and a number of others. So if that helps.
Thank you. Vanuka, if I can, I suppose, build on a little bit of your rationale there in terms of, talking about transparency and accountability. I'm kind of interested in the bringing the community with us piece as well, and just wondering, again, what you might see as the both disadvantages and advantages of a consultative step to ensure that we not only have transparency and accountability, but we have greater community buy-in.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the advantage is highlighting where there's information that we either know or don't know, and I think a really good use case for that is the future freight ring route alignment, PNITI. So you'll actually note that in the long term, we haven't signalled any route in the strategic networks, and that's because that's dependent on a business case for the ring route being progressed. I guess that use case highlights the fact that we truly don't have a firm view on where that route will go, and I think our ongoing conversations with the Bunnythorpe community in particular, that's something around highlighting that we truly haven't done the work to identify where that route exactly will go. We just know it needs to connect from east to west somewhere. I guess the disadvantage, and I wouldn't necessarily call it disadvantage because it is effectively creating an expectation by the community and our partners that we will invest in the way that we say we will through our successive long-term plans. So effectively that's showing a level of commitment, which I think is an opportunity to highlight that, if there's a particular route that we may look to put in new cycle infrastructure or new public transport infrastructure in years 1, 2 or 3 of the LTP or further on, that's signalled early on.
Great.
Through you, Mr. Chair, sorry to keep jumping in, but I think just one thing to bear in mind, I think in terms of the advantages and disadvantages of a consultation or socialisation process for this document at this time. There's been a number of answers around timing. I think one of the other things we'd need to think about is what genuine consultation looks like. So genuine consultation is options and assessment and an open mind. So when we look at these modes, freight, cycling, public transport, walking, general traffic, freight, we're taking a big lead from Piniti, which has been endorsed. Cycling, we're taking a big lead from the Urban Cycle Network Master Plan, been approved by Council. Public transport, we're taking a big lead from the work that the Regional Council is doing in terms of the review of public transport. Walking, we're taking a big lead from Streets for People, which is already in the LTP and being consulted on. General traffic, I don't have an example, but I'm sure Vanuka might. So I guess my thing is there's a question of what is consultation going to add at this time relative to the risk of endorsing this piece of work and moving on. A little bit, to be honest, I like the conversation we had last week about the Regional Climate Change Action Plan. How much do we want to bring the community with us, consultate versus take the existing information decisions, make a decision and move forward.
Great. Thank you both for those answers, Mr. Chair.
I might just jump in here with a question. This Waka-Kotahi round of funding, is this something that comes around every year, or is it only once every 3 years we can apply for this, or longer?
The NLTP goes around every 3 years, so we're currently developing NLTP 24 to 27, and then once that goes through and the decisions are made, then the next process starts for the 27 to 30 NLTP.
Thank you. We keep saying here that this isn't really doing anything or adding anything more to what we've already discussed, and that this doesn't set in place any actions or interventions. But if I look from page 147 to page 154, this consolidates about 7 A3 pages of proposed interventions. I recognise this, voting for this wouldn't commit us to having to do it, but would you agree that this indicates to the community these are the interventions we want to make over the next 10 to 30 years?
No, and I guess I sort of tossed up whether I include that appendix or not, because ultimately that report was done by expert advice, basically, and effectively what that does is indicate that what things could look like, I guess, to elected members, but in reality, none of those interventions have or will have been committed to. I guess there are some interventions, I should say, that do align with the interventions that have been proposed just from an objective point of view that are already in train, such as Streets for People, some of the actions around the Urban Cycle Network Master Plan, including some of the projects that have come in through this chamber in the last couple of weeks. They all align, but what that list of interventions does is just provide some guidance for our operational staff around, if in theory this was what we wanted to do, this is some technical guidance to support operational decision making, but any projects that we would do would come through this chamber anyway.
So to me, that seems, and thank you for your answer, that index seems to reflect what's put forward in attachment 3, page 121 to 123 around phasing. That seems to reflect the phasing that we're indicating in the body of the report. Therefore, we're indicating to our officers, to our community, to our managers that that is the pathway we want to take.
I'm struggling to keep up on pages, but...
Page 121. It discusses our short, medium and long-term phasing.
I think I'll try to answer that question. I think the short, medium, long-term phasing is a good example of where we need to do a lot more work to create a bit more tangible timeframes, I guess. The reality is that there's a big program of work that needs to be done in the transport planning space for the city. One of those is obviously to put in clearer timeframes. The short, medium, long-term timeframes align with what's in the PNITI program. It's effectively somewhat non-committal, and one of those I would strongly suggest that council officers work to provide a more granular timeframe, such as every 3 years or every 10 years, because I acknowledge short, medium, long-term doesn't necessarily mean anything, but that's what we've got at this stage.
Thank you. The Mayor.
Oh, thanks, Mr. Chair. Look, I'm getting some really mixed messages here. Mr. Murphy, did you say that we shouldn't consult?
I didn't say whether you should consult I didn't say whether you should or shouldn't consult. I said you'd need to think, if you decide to consult, you'd need to think hard about the value of a consultation exercise on this document at this time. Bearing in mind, as I said, that those 5 priority routes are taking direction from decisions that have already been made or have already been consulted on. So when you consult, you need to be really mindful of why you're consulting, that you've got options, and you're doing that with an open mind. So when you're taking direction from a heap of documents that have already been approved and consulted on, or programs and actions that are already underway, the value of consultation is diminished.
Okay. Thank you for your lengthy answer. Mr. Chair, through you, and whether it's you, Vanuka, or you, Mr. Murphy, On page 32, and my colleague alluded to it, you said that there was no priority over things yet, and maybe this is a typo, I don't know, in the report, but it says the most important priority is freight, cycling, public transport, walking, and then general transport. So is that a typo, or are we just, it's just a bit of a mix-up?
I would suggest if that was, I would suggest reading that as bullet points rather than than a list. I guess the next paragraph does highlight that we will have priority modes across the entire city, but having a route designated as a priority route for a certain mode doesn't mean that the other non-selected modes won't have access. For example, in the city centre, I think I'm not going out there too much in saying that walking and cycling, or in particular walking, is probably the priority route in the city centre, particularly around the square. That doesn't mean we would necessarily exclusively cater for walking and cycling. It just means that the way we design our streetscapes and maintain our assets, for example, the delivery of the Streets for People program, would strongly suggest that walking and cycling is the priority mode, as opposed to getting freight vehicles, for example, around the
Aren't
square.
we already doing that with some of our more recent interventions?
What was that, sorry?
Aren't we already doing that with some of our more recent interventions?
Which interventions would those be?
I think your colleague next to you led it on the square there. You part-funded it, or the organisation you're about to work for part-funded it, the Streets for People.
Yeah. So I guess the Streets for People program is a good example of where we would be prioritising a certain type of mode over others. And so that's a good example of where these strategic networks are already sort of being implemented on the ground.
Okay. And you say that the maps or the interventions aren't really important or don't commit us. So what are we signing up to then? I'm getting mixed messages, and I think some of my colleagues are as well.
What you're signing up to is a culmination, or I guess a collective view of what all of our previous transport decisions have been. Effectively, this is an accumulation of what we've already signed up to, or what we are in part signed up to by central government or the regional council.
I don't think anybody disagrees with you, Whanouka. Just the time frame, and remember I sit on the Regional Transport Committee, is there, if we decided that we wanted to have a little bit more socialisation around this, and I understand the devil in the detail, a month or two, do you think that's going to make a difference? I'm just trying to figure out what the rush is, because we've had literally 2 days, 3 days to read this.
From an RLTP perspective, if it was a month or two, no. We'll be developing that over the next little while, and certainly the start in this first 6 months this year is really around that strategic front end of that document. And so making sure that the work that the city is looking to do is aligning with what we're looking to do as a region will be really important. And that's part of what is in this document that's been presented to Council today. When you get into the detail of the programs and things that fall out of that, certainly as we get into the middle part of this year, they'll be really important that City Council have a really strong view as to the direction they're going, so they can best place themselves to be seen positively through the RLTP process, but also by Whakatahi in their funding round as well.
Okay. And I think in addition to that, I guess noting David's point earlier, because this is a accumulation of our existing transport plans and strategies, I guess elected members need to consider the risk of any particular outputs out of any engagement or consultation process, relitigating any of the documents that come before it, such as the Urban Cycle Network Master Plan, the Asset Management Plan, PNITI, and that sort of thing.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying there's a lot of detail in here, and some of your answers are saying, trust us, don't worry, we're not committing you to that. But I've seen other documents that we do, they get used against council at times. And is this your document or our document?
This would be a Palmerston North City Council document.
Thank you.
Just through you, Mr. Chair, if I could just clarify or add to that, sorry. I think if there was going to be a pause on this piece of work, building on the earlier answers, my advice would be that there is an engagement or socialisation process, not a public consultation process.
Councillor Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, Whenuka and team, for presenting today. Admittedly, a new councillor to the team. My experience to date tells me that the officers report to the council, we get to debate it in chamber and decide next steps from there, and I'm finding it difficult to rationale when we are seeing central government at the top, regional land transport, Waka Kotahi, all of those at regional, national level, and this piece of work is quite extensive in my opinion, and it's relatively new. The question I had was around the Urban Cycle Network Master Plan, and this plan summary sits outside the PNITI business case, which is fine. But if I was to look at where is Palmerston North City Council's lean into this piece of work, it would have to be the bottom 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 layers, which sit below the regional plan. Is that a fair assumption for us to make?
Yep. Effectively, the strategic transport plan, the asset management plan, spatial plan, urban cycle net master plan, and this piece of work is led by this council, and then the Palmerston North Integrated Transport Initiative was a Waka Kotahi and Palmerston North City Council piece of work.
Wonderful. Thanks. Can I just, Mr. Chair, can I ask the officers a question? The work that we're about to undertake in the LTP, are we likely to see this network strategy come up on those agenda items? Because what we're hearing today is that we've already consulted on our transport methodology inside, for example, the LTP and that sort of stuff. So.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. So I guess any strategy and planning process does tend to build on the previous one. So and there's always a suite of strategic documents that exist at a particular point in time, no matter when you start a individual planning exercise. So we're about to embark on an LTP process, which will include the opportunity to develop a new suite of strategies and plans. While we're doing that, the bulk of these documents that you see on page 32 will be as they are at present. So, as I said earlier, I think if this document was approved, there could be the opportunity to incorporate some of the key spatial elements of that into the strategic transport plan that goes out with the LTP.
Thanks, David. Thanks.
Thank you. That's the end of our list of questioning. So thank you very much to all of you for answering those. Oh, no, apologies. Councillor Bowen's. Oh, no.
Sorry, no. Fast fingers for the next round.
All right. So thank you. You can return to your seats. I'll now look for someone to move them. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, councillors, I've got an amendment to this to lie this on the table for socialisation amongst us. And I have a seconder.
Just point of order, it's not an amendment, it's a procedural motion.
Sorry, a procedural motion. Terminology, I apologise. And councillors, I just feel that do we need a strategic plan? Absolutely, absolutely. Has this been socialised? No. And look, we understand the officers are backing it, and I acknowledge our friends from the Regional Council and NZTA. But look, this didn't make the agenda meeting, this report. It's significant, 168 pages, whatever it is. And look, we respect the officers' advice, but we just need to understand a little bit more about the detail. And we're responsible to the public too. And I respect that there has been a whole lot of extra reports that have fed into this. But again, the devil is in the detail, and I just would like to understand that detail a little bit more. It was acknowledged that we can have extra time to feed into the regional transport plan as well, and I see no harm at all in bringing us with this, or all of us with it. Otherwise, I certainly won't sign up to this without understanding the detail. Yes, there has been...
Mr. Mayor, I think you've explained Your procedural motion?
Yep, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr.
Right.
Chair, could I just seek clarification, please, on the motion in front of us, which includes consultation, when the officer's advice was clearly to not go down that route?
I'm happy to take consultation out, but it was really consultation with us as a council first. But it does need socialising and workshopping to bring back to council.
Right. So we're... Councillor Hancock? All right, in line with our standing orders, this being a procedural motion, we'll move straight to a vote. That has passed, 9 votes for, 6 against. We'll now move on to item 7. Item 8. Is that correct? All righty. Bear with me a moment.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair, can we just see the voting results, please?
Officers have said they'll run it at the end of the meeting now that we've moved on, so I believe we'll come back to it before we close today. All right. Is that okay? We'll carry on. All right. We'll now move on to item 8, recommendation to the Economic Growth Committee, that the committee receive the memorandum titled Process and Options to Establish and Enforce Heavy Vehicle Routes of the 22nd of February 2023 Economic Growth Committee. We have Vanuka, our former Senior Transport Planner, and Peter Ridge, our Senior Policy Analyst, presenting.
Good morning again. We'll take this report as read and happy to answer any questions.
Questions, councillors? Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Vanuka and Peter, for being available for questions and for the report. Interested kind of what you might have done by way of looking at how other councils use bylaws to help inform some of the heavy traffic movements in their cities. I'm thinking particularly inland cities and grid cities like Hamilton and Christchurch.
We haven't been able to reach out directly to those councils. However, we have an understanding that there's a similar bylaw in place in Christchurch around the parking of heavy vehicles. Ultimately, the capacity for that council to enforce that bylaw is very much dependent on the same considerations that we've outlined in this report.
So beyond the awareness of Christchurch, there wasn't any analysis of what's being done in Aotearoa?
No, there wasn't. I guess councils use a whole bunch of different mechanisms across the country in terms of transport planning. I would say that bylaws are not necessarily seen as a preferred tool of restricting types of traffic, just because of the difficulties in terms of enforcing those bylaws, and then therefore and the difficulties in ensuring or evaluating compliance with those bylaws. What tends to happen is that infrastructure interventions are used to give effect to those outcomes that councils are trying to achieve. I guess with respect to, in the last 2 to 3 years, in particular, the use of tactical temporary interventions being seen as a preferred route to achieve those outcomes, because they do achieve the outcome that council is trying to achieve, and in addition to a whole bunch of other outcomes around placemaking and road safety and increased vegetation and that sort of thing, and amenity. So that's traditionally been the process in which councils would seek to progress rather than a regulatory approach.
Is there any possible complementarity between having some regulatory instruments as well as the high-cost things like infrastructure?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think using all elements of the toolbox is absolutely something that we should be considering. I think with respect to the high cost, particularly those more temporary interventions, when you can compare the capital costs of those temporary interventions with, I guess, operational time required to develop and implement a bylaw, and then ongoing costs around enforcement and that sort of thing, I'd say the benefit cost ratio across both approaches becomes very similar. I'll hand off to my colleague Peter to talk about, I guess, the process in terms of how we would seek to implement a bylaw and I guess the timeframes required.
Yeah, so as many of you will be aware, the process for developing a bylaw is it starts with identifying the problem to be addressed and whether a bylaw is the most appropriate way. So we've factored some of that into the information that's in the report. That's a standard policy process. It's probably more the staging and the steps that happen first, and the work that Vinuka's outlined in terms of identifying through documents like PNITI and other strategic documents that identify where heavy vehicles are the preferred route, the preferred mode, give us the framework in which then the bylaw can step in, if it's appropriate, to create a designation that can be enforced. One of the limitations we've identified through the report, though, is bylaws as a method of enforcement for this type of issue can be weak, I suppose, and that's a combination of factors. One is the opportunities for enforcement within the Act, the Local Government Act, and also the resources for enforcement. Typically in this situation, as a moving vehicle, it would be falling to the police. So we're not only dealing with our own capacity, but the capacity of the police to enforce. So the process for developing a bylaw is coming at the end of a more strategic consideration of those heavy vehicles and what we're trying to achieve, and looking at all the tools for achieving those outcomes, which may include some infrastructural treatment and may include some bylaw regulatory interventions where appropriate. Yeah.
Thanks for the background around process, Peter, and thanks, Vinuka, as well for your response there. So, understand we're a year or possibly two, depending on budgetary constraints, away from reviewing the traffic bylaw. If when we get to that review process, we do decide that we would like to explore with the community their appetite for some level of intervention around heavy vehicle routes in the city, do we have the information to hand that we would need to be able to undertake an effective consultation with the community?
I think we do. There are some strong connections with the previous item, the strategic networks, and the work that's been done there and pulling together existing information to identify how we want to approach those kinds of decisions in the future gives us a basis to make informed decisions for any specific interventions the bylaw might make. We still would want to consider whether the bylaw is the right intervention for the right street, and also that consideration around police capacity to undertake enforcement. So our engagement in advance of going out to any formal consultation would also have to include the police and any other partners we may need to include along the way.
Thank you. And would that process include a more thorough evaluation of comparative bylaws around Aotearoa, or would we just be working with what we've done so far?
there's always some value to be found in looking at other local authorities, but the issues that we face are not radically different from other councils. So it's very unlikely that we find another council's got the magic bullet that we haven't found. So we're working in the same legal framework. So we seek legal advice, particularly when we're undertaking something particularly new, for ensuring compliance with the Local Government Act, the Bylaws Act, the Land Transport Act. Another council will be operating in the same environment. We always undertake our own legal research to make sure that we're doing things in the appropriate way. Looking at other councils can sometimes provide us with some inspiration, but isn't necessarily the most effective way to undertake that work.
Thank you both. Appreciate the answers, Mr. Chair.
Councillors, just to let you know, in the spirit of fairness, given we've got a lot of work to do after this meeting today, I won't let people jump back into the queue after they've asked questions, so just make sure you get all your questions through in your first lot. Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for that warning. I think my only questions are about the impact on option 1 of the decision we just made to lie the NOP on the table. So you presented, they said there's 2 distinct approaches available to identify and establish heavy vehicle routes. The first being to use Pinnerty, which leans heavily into that NOP work. So is option 1 still on the table if we're lying the NOP on the table? Too many tables in that question, but you get where I'm going.
I don't see why not. I think it would have been a lot easier, I think, on the officer's end. And I speak for whoever comes after me, that if that strategic networks piece was in place, just because it is that one source of truth for all of our transport planning considerations. Effectively, if we ever needed to have this conversation again, whether it be for heavy vehicles or for some other mode, we've got that consistent platform in which we could refer to. So yes, absolutely. I think it doesn't preclude it, but I think it would have been beneficial.
Okay, thank you. I'll leave that there.
Councillor Finlay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. 2 questions on page 188 and one on 193. The first question on page 188. The first paragraph, that's an amazing statement. Can I ask, when did we start to observe that the roadie network was starting to deteriorate?
I wouldn't have an answer to that. I suspect it was something that's been done for a very long time.
Right. And the next question is the map you have there. I have difficulty reading it. I think even young eyes would have difficulty reading that. And I notice it's 5 years old. Is it possible to get an updated map we could read?
I think it would be absolutely key to having updated information. Ultimately, we're working with the resources we've got and highlighting, and that was highlighted, I think, in the previous report, in that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the transport planning space, and getting data for all types of modes and all types of use, whether that's qualitative or quantitative, is a big priority for us.
And my question on 193 is, you've got this crossing here, and I'm quite interested. You see a pedestrian crossing. There's a crossing there for a cyclist. Nothing for mobility scooters or wheelchairs or anything like that. Are they to use the ones, the pedestrian? And what about scooters? Because they are increasing dramatically in the city. Sorry? Page 193.
I would say that all those types of uses would be able to use that facility that you've shown, that is shown.
So we've got a large area for cycling, and then the rest of it's just for everything else?
Correct, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
To make Councillor Finlay feel better, I also can't read the map. Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and I just only have one question, and it's just in relation to page 188, which is the explanatory paragraph talking about figure 1. there are a number of streets that are actually itemised there in terms of increased heavy vehicle use. I think I've asked this question before. I think probably we've only got about perhaps 4 or 5 monitoring points within the city that monitor heavy traffic. So I'm just wondering how we got to understand the increase in heavy traffic in some of those streets which don't have monitoring.
I might ask Chris if he wants to chime in, but my understanding is we do tube counts all across the network for most roads, and as part of that process we do, the tube counters do tell us what proportion of heavy vehicle traffic is available on those routes. That information has come out of the PNITI Network Options Report.
Greetings, Council. My name is Chris Lay. I'm the Activity Manager of Transport. Essentially, we have a rolling program of tube counts that has been done by Roading Logistics. They have a program of certain roads around the network. It will capture traffic volumes, speeds, and the heavy vehicle classification. And from that will be the summary data gets imported to our RAM network for a RAM program to be assessed and can be used.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. My understanding is I asked specifically previously about Albert Street. And Albert Street, if to the casual observer, there has been a significant increase of heavy traffic using that road. But the last time I asked the question was that there was no monitoring capability on that street at all. So can we clarify that, please?
So I guess we will have previous sets of data. The tube counts are done on I guess, for a week length, generally about once a year. So we'd compare that previous sets of data to figure out what that growth is. We don't have a full-time monitoring of traffic.
What I will clarify as well is, so that's I guess our ongoing monitoring of particularly heavy vehicles is we do tube counts for a week, 1 week every year. The information that you see in the graph that I acknowledge is very hard to read has been sourced through E-Road fleet data, so that's effectively transponders on a lot of our heavy vehicles sort of get aggregated up, so that's a much clearer understanding of time of day, speed, braking, that sort of thing, all aggregated up into that map.
Yeah,
and that's something we don't do on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, thanks, Vanuka, and thanks, Chris. And yes, I've obviously got grave concerns about this heavy traffic. Thanks.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Just one question from me. There's 2 options outlined in this paper with cons and pros. However, the recommendation that's proposed is just to receive the memorandum. Are officers looking for any direction from elected members today?
As I recall, the conversation last term and the resolution, the request was for options to identify and enforce heavy vehicle routes. So we, officers rightly or wrongly, interpreted that as an investigative piece of work around the options that elected members could then receive and make a decision about whether there was anything they wanted to do over and above the existing, I guess, transport planning and enforcement activities of the council.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, officers. That's exceeded our list of questions. So I will now move, if you bear with me a moment to go back to the right page, I'll move the recommendation that the committee receive this memorandum. I look for a seconder, the Mayor. I won't speak to this. I'll leave this to the rest of the chamber to discuss, other than by saying I thank the officers for their report. Councillor Barrett. Oh, apologies, the Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, this is obviously around, and thank you to the officers for pulling the work together. It's around disincentivising freight and truck movements on our city and urban roads. And I think my colleague next to me highlighted, Albert Street, which has 2 schools, a number of preschools, and obviously it's an urban suburban road. Yet it starts to carry a lot of freight movement. But then on the other hand, we want to be a freight and logistics centre as well. So it's really understanding where these freight movements need to go. And I think if you look at the lack of investment and from some partners in our regional roads, that is where what has led drivers to come into the city. A lot of it's controlled with this now, and changing drivers, GPS, what's the quickest route? We do it ourselves when we trying to find somewhere, and they ultimately send a truck. And I've seen tankers in the middle of the town here. So we've got to try and find out what is the best way of doing that. Again, the options there give us is a bylaw. We've seen how that possibly doesn't work, and it's quite problematic. We've then seen about our penalty plan, and that's long. It's long too, and it requires partner investment as well. So it is a difficult one to sort, and I do wonder if there is some more communication with our freight firms. I sit on the Te Utanganui governance group, and I can't recall us actually going to the freight firms and saying, these are the routes we would want you to take and the reasons why. And I do wonder if there's a level of communication that's required to those firms, because we're going to have this problem in the years to come, even with backing penalty, because that's a multi-year program.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the officers' work gone into reports here as one of the elected representatives that was keen to see this discussion advanced. What I struggle with is the way that it's being framed as an either or. I think it's a both and if we actually want to get on top of this. I think the sort of massive cost that this city is facing in terms of the direct costs on infrastructure, the displacement of other modes of transport by schools and other areas where we'd like to see much less heavy traffic, the noise, the disruption, etc. All of those costs building up, to me, suggest that we should be looking at all the tools rather than just some of the tools. Given that I understand the traffic bylaw is up for review in the reasonably near future, and given that officers assured us that they had sufficient information to hand to support this conversation going into that bylaw review, I'm comfortable to vote in support here, simply to receive, but would signal to the chamber that it's my view, and quite firmly held, that we need to have a conversation with our community about the potential for a bylaw to contribute to the range of things that we will try to do to minimize the quite substantial impact that we are seeing as trucks continue to expand and damage our streets and our local neighborhood roads that should be largely free of heavy vehicles unless they're doing local deliveries. So very keen for a both and I think this report has given us some clarity on the potential complementarity between the approaches that we might take. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I share similar views to both of the previous speakers in that this is a yes and conversation. I think what we read in this report and also from the previous report, this is a complex environment that we step into, where Palmerston North is actually just one player in a complex networks of relationships. Transport doesn't appear on our routes from thin air. We're part of that wider transport network, and our planning in this regard has to be joined up or it won't be effective. So I was interested to read about how Pinnerty will play into this, and also in Section 5, additional option for consideration, the discussion about that engagement with the freight operators, which is already being undertaken, it says here, for Te Utanganui. So interested to hear the Mayor's comment there that he's not seen that, because that seems to be a really sensible way to progress this. I think that's what the Mayor was saying, that we should be taking our community with us, which very much aligns with the view that Councillor Barrett is taking there, that this is a community issue at its heart. It's about the kind of traffic we want to see on which streets. How do we decide what goes where? And actually the reality that we don't decide. The people who drive cars, our pedestrians, our cyclists, they decide which streets they want to use. And we have to work with them to make that network work. We also have to be mindful of the partners in how we fund that network. And that will continue to be an ongoing concern of mine following today's debate, and an ongoing consideration as we pick up this kind of work into our wider planning document. So happy to support this, looking forward to seeing where it goes, maybe as we come back to that NOP discussion.
Any more speakers? Well, by way of just a very short right of reply, I'm trying to recall if it was this item or the last where I read that one heavy vehicle equals about 10,000 cars travelling over any given piece of road. But as we move, in light of our discussions with CEDA and our state of the city's economics, or of our picture at the moment, as we move to focusing on being a freight and logistics centre, we're just going to see more and more heavy vehicles on our urban roads. So I agree with the previous speakers that it has to be yes and. But I think that the Mayor is particularly correct in our communication with industry. Although I would love for our live stream here to have 20,000 viewers, we have about 100, and I don't think many of them are freight drivers. In fact, I don't think many of them are freight company owners. And so, yes, there may have been some engagement in regard to our central distribution hub, but as a council, not everything we have to do is just about spending money or delivering projects. It's also about delivering effective and clear communication with our community about how we can guide them in the right direction. And so, at the end of the day, without a bylaw, if it's easier to drive down Albert Street, even if we build a lovely, brand new, fantastic ring road, if it's easier to drive down Albert Street, they're still going to do it. So it's about making sure that we are doing both at the same time. And now I would hope that a new ring road would be easier to drive down than Albert Street. But until we've put that in place, and that could be another, well, goodness, I was talking to somebody who was on council 30 years ago and they were talking about building the ring road. So that could be another, let's conservatively say 5 years down the road, not to be ironic, that we need to look at some immediate solutions to how we deal with this problem. So I look forward to discussing it more with my colleagues. All right, and with that, we will vote. That has passed, 15 votes in favour and none against. As we're just over midday, we'll break now for lunch, returning at 1 p.m.
Mr. Chair, apologies, I won't be here this afternoon after you return.
Thank you.